Doyle didn't pay her debt because he was a decent man. He paid it because... Pratt's voice had been climbing for the better part of 10 minutes, and the Upper Iskut survey map Doyle was trying to read, in the corner of the company store, required a certain quality of silence that Pratt's nasal wheedling was rapidly destroying. That was the truth of it, nothing noble in it at all. Hattie knew this later. She would come to understand it precisely, but standing on the sawdust floor of Pratt's store, in the last week of November, with her wrists pinched white inside Pratt's grip, she didn't know anything except terror and the particular, unbearable shame of being handled in front of witnesses. The debt was $65. Alec's debt, really. Borrowed from the company in increments over 2 years, passage money, tools, seed grain for a kitchen garden that had never grown. Alec had died in August when a cable snapped at the upper mill, and the debt had transferred to Hattie the way everything in Cairo transferred, without her consent and without ceremony. She'd spent the autumn trying to pay it. She took in washing, she mended work clothes for the mill hands, she'd sold the garden tools. None of it was enough. Pratt had called the balance due the first week of November. And now it was the last, and the temperature outside had dropped to the kind of cold that turned exhaled breath into ice crystals before it reached the air. "I need more time," she'd told him. "Just until spring. I can cook for the bunkhouse." Pratt had laughed the way men like him always laughed, through his nose, as if the sound cost nothing. "The bunkhouse cook isn't you, Mrs. Dunmore. The balance is due. Tonight you come work upstairs at the lodge, or you walk out that door with what you're wearing." She was wearing a wool dress, a shawl with a tear in the left shoulder, and boots that had been resoled twice. Outside, it was 30 below. She hadn't cried. She'd wanted to. She could feel the pressure of it behind her eyes, solid as a stone. But she'd kept her jaw locked and her back straight, because weeping in front of Pratt felt like handing him a weapon. Then a map was folded and placed on the counter. A heavy leather coin purse followed it. "Count it," said the man who'd set them down. He wasn't looking at Pratt when he said it. He was looking at the back wall, at a row of tinned goods, with the expression of a man enduring mild weather. $65. There'll be enough for interest. Pratt counted. There was enough. The man turned and walked out of the store without a word to Hattie. Without a word to anyone. The door banged once behind him, and the cold swallowed him whole. It took Hattie 4 minutes to understand what had happened. Then she picked up her shawl, pulled it tight around her shoulders, and walked out into the killing cold. She saw him at the far edge of town, loading a supply wagon hitched to a broad-chested roan. She didn't know his name. She'd seen him before. He came down from the high country twice a season, bought his flour and shot, and coal oil, spoke to no one, and went back up. The mill hands called him the hermit, but they said it without contempt, the way you'd describe a landmark. She walked toward him. The snow was old and packed, and her boots punched through the crust with each step. He saw her coming. He finished loading the last sack and climbed up onto the wagon bench without waiting. "That money," she said when she reached him, "I'll pay it back." He looked down at her from the bench. His face was tanned dark from high country wind and scored with the kind of lines that came from squinting into 20 years of mountain light. He was large. Wide through the shoulders, built the way men are built when they have to move their own weight through deep snow for months at a time. His eyes were grey-green, the color of lake ice over gravel. "Forget it," he said. "Go back inside." "I pay my debts," she said, "every one of them." Something shifted in his expression. Not softness, exactly. More like recognition, the way you'd look at a piece of equipment that had turned out to be better made than you'd expected. "It wasn't a loan," he said. "It was an irritation tax. I paid it to make him stop talking." He picked up the reins. "Go inside, Mrs. Dunmore," she said. "Hattie." He nodded once, as if filing that away somewhere it wouldn't be needed. He clicked his tongue, and the roan leaned into the harness. She stood in the snow and watched him go. She had nowhere to go back to. The store was Pratt's. The lodge was Pratt's. The mill cabin she'd shared with Alec had been reassigned to a new man the week after the funeral. Carrow was a company town. Everything in it belonged to Pratt, and Pratt had just told her exactly what her options were. She started walking. He heard her before he turned around to look. The snow had a particular sound when weight moved through it, at a certain pace, a slow, dogged crunch, rhythmic and deliberate. It had been following him for 20 minutes. He'd been telling himself it was an animal. He hauled back on the reins. He turned around. 70 yards back, in the center of the trail, a small figure stood in the blue dusk. No winter coat, a shawl and a thin wool dress and inadequate boots. She wasn't running. She wasn't calling out. She was just standing there in the cold with her arms wrapped around herself and her face pointed at him. The temperature was going to drop another 10 degrees by midnight. "Damn," he said to no one. He set the brake and climbed down. When he reached her, her lips had taken on a greyish tinge, and she was shivering badly enough that her teeth couldn't click together properly. She looked up at him, defiant, as a barn cat cornered by a dog, jaw clamped hard despite the trembling. "There's nothing up this mountain," he told her. "No room. No space for another person." "I owe you $65, she said. Her voice was thin from the cold, but it didn't waver. "I work my debts." He stared at her. She was half frozen, and she was arguing with him about financial arrangements. It was the most stubborn thing he'd seen in 15 years of mountain living, and he'd once watched a wolverine drag a moose quarter uphill for 300 meters. You can't work if you're dead. He took off his outer canvas coat, the good one, the one he'd re-waxed at the end of October, and put it around her shoulders. Then he took her by the arm, not gently, and walked her back to the wagon. She didn't thank him. He didn't want her to. His name was Doyle. She learned this when he told the roan to whore, and the horse ignored him. And he said the horse's name, Prospect, and then added, under his breath, something that sounded like "good thing one of us listens, and it isn't me." She asked his name. He told her. Nothing else volunteered. The drive up the mountain was 3 hours, and the storm the sky had been promising all week arrived in the second hour. The trail disappeared under blowing snow. Doyle drove by memory, leaning forward slightly, watching the tree line, making small adjustments to the reins with a steadiness that Hattie, sitting rigid beside him with his coat wrapped around her, found more calming than she wanted to admit. She didn't speak. He didn't speak. The wind spoke for both of them. The cabin materialized out of the dark like something that had grown there naturally. Low and heavy, chinked tight, set back against a granite bluff that broke the north wind, a lean-to on the east side for Prospect. A woodpile stacked head-high under an overhang. The chimney was cold. Inside, the dark was total, and the cold was the same inside as out. Doyle had her sit on the edge of the bed, a rope frame with a thick mattress of dried spruce boughs and folded wool, while he built the fire. He moved fast, and without fumbling, the way a person moves when they've done something 10,000 times. Within minutes, a small fire was catching in the stone hearth. Then, a larger one. He filled a kettle, hung it over the growing flame, and brought her a tin cup of cold water first. "Drink slowly. Don't drink fast." She drank slowly. He put an extra blanket over her shoulders, and then crossed to the other side of the cabin and sat in the only chair, a worn rocker near the hearth. He pulled his own blanket around his shoulders, propped his boots against the hearthstone, and closed his eyes. "Stay in the bed," he said, without opening them. "Don't let the fire go low." He was asleep in 4 minutes. Hattie sat in the strange dark in the stranger's bed, listening to the storm tear at the roof and feeling the warmth beginning, very slowly, to reach her bones. She looked at the ceiling. Rough-hewn spruce poles, the gaps packed with moss. She looked at the walls. She looked at the cold, cluttered corner of the cabin, where a broken pack frame leaned against the logs, its crossbar cracked through, lashed badly with rope already fraying at the loops. She looked at the fire. She looked at Doyle's sleeping face. The hard lines of it, the closed-off quality, the way even in sleep he held himself a little apart from the world. She thought about the ledger, $65. At fair wages for domestic labor in a remote settlement, 20 cents a day, the going rate she'd seen posted in the Ontario papers before she'd come north. She could figure the time. It would take a while, but it was finite. Finite was the only kind of problem she trusted. She lay down. She did not sleep for a long time. Doyle woke to the smell of wood smoke and something else. Bannock. Proper oven bannock, not the sad flat pan version. The smell alone took him somewhere far back in his memory before he was fully awake. He opened his eyes. Hattie was crouched at the hearth, her back to him, tending something in the Dutch oven he hadn't used in 2 years because the lid handle had broken. Except the lid handle wasn't broken anymore. It was wrapped tight, with a lashing of green rawhide cut from the scrap of deer hide he kept by the door for patching, done wet, cinched hard, the kind that would set like iron when it dried. Doyle sat up slowly. The broken pack frame in the corner was gone. He looked for it. It was standing upright by the door, the cracked crossbar replaced with a length of dried alder rod from his firewood stack, lashed at both joints with figure-8 wraps in waxed cord. The wraps were perfect. He'd had a pack frame repaired by a saddler in Fort St. James for $2 once. And this was better than that man's work. He stood. He walked to the hearth shelf. His flour tin was open. She'd lined the inside with a scrap of clean cloth. Part of her shawl, he realized, cut away from the hem, and the tin was sealed at the rim with a thin bead of candle wax. "Weevils," she said, without turning around. Her voice was matter-of-fact, steady. They'd gotten into the bottom third. I sifted what I could save. The rest I burned. You're down about 1.5 pounds, but what's left is clean. Doyle stood in the middle of his cabin and looked at all of it, at the repaired things, at her hands which he could see now that she'd half-turned toward the fire. The rawhide work had bitten into the tips of her fingers again and again through the night. Raw, smeared with dried blood, she'd worked for hours in the dark while he slept, repairing what was broken, preserving what could be saved, asking nothing. He looked from her hands to her face. She was watching the Dutch oven with the calm focus of a person who has decided what she is doing and sees no reason to make a production of it. He could not form a single word. "Coffee's ready," she said at last. She still didn't look at him. "Don't let it sit too long or it turns." The birch bark was her idea. She found a curled piece behind the woodpile and used the blunt end of a charcoal stick from the fire to mark it. She tacked it to the log wall beside the door on her second morning. Doyle pretended not to look at it. He looked at it constantly. 20 cents a day is the going rate for domestic labor. She told him that evening, not looking up from a pair of wool socks she was unraveling and reknitting tighter. "With the pack frame and the Dutch oven lid, I'm crediting myself 50 cents each as skilled repair work, fair market for backcountry trade." "You're crediting yourself generously," he said, meaning it was generous to him. "I'm crediting myself correctly," she replied. He understood then that the distinction mattered to her enormously, and he kept his mouth shut. They found a rhythm the way two careful people find a rhythm, not all at once, and not without friction, but steadily, the way ice forms on still water. He left before first light to check his trap lines. She kept the fire, the water, the cabin. When he returned at dusk, the cold he carried in on his clothes met warmth that was waiting for it, and that was a thing he hadn't realized he'd been missing until it was there every night. He didn't want to think too hard about that. She was relentless in a way that unsettled him. She didn't complain about the cold or the isolation. or the smell of the green hides he draped over the drying rack inside. When the temperature dropped too low to cure them outside, when he came back one afternoon with a quarter of moose slung over Prospect's saddle and dropped it on the table without preamble, she just picked up the knife, asked him where. He wanted it broken down and got to work. Her cuts were economical and correct. She'd done this before. "My father trapped," she said, reading his expression. "Algonquin Park country. I grew up following his lines." She didn't elaborate. He didn't ask. But he filed it away. In the same place he'd filed her name. Somewhere quiet, where he kept things that mattered. It was a January night. Heavy snow pressing against the windows, the kind of storm that made the cabin feel like an island. Doyle was at the table mending a snapped snare wire. Hattie was by the hearth cutting doeskin into narrow strips with the precise economy of someone who'd planned exactly what she needed before she started. "Alec thought the North was going to save us," she said. Doyle didn't move. He'd learned that if he moved, she stopped. He'd read about the strikes up the Stickeen. He thought we could stake a claim, make enough to buy land back home. Real land, not a company property. She cut another strip. Even. Steady. He was a good man. He wasn't a lucky one. She let that sit for a moment. The mill took him in August. Cable failure on the upper deck. It was quick at least. That's what they told me. I've always been grateful they thought to say that. She held a strip of doeskin up to the firelight and examined it. He borrowed the passage money to bring me north. The tools. The seed money for the garden. He was going to pay it all back with wages. He always meant to pay it back. She lowered the strip. The company's ledger doesn't care about intentions. Neither does Winter. She turned and looked at Doyle directly. The fire made the brown of her eyes almost amber. "I am not a woman who sits down in the snow," she said quietly. "Whatever Pratt thinks he's owed, whatever this mountain thinks it's owed, I don't sit down in the snow." Doyle put the snare wire on the table. He looked at her for a long time. "I know," he said. He picked the wire back up. She went back to her doeskin strips. Outside, the storm moved on, and neither of them needed to say anything more. The birchbark ledger stood at $12.40 when the men came up the mountain. March had arrived the way it always did in the high country. Not as a thaw, but as an argument. The snowpack turning grey and treacherous, the temperature swinging between cold and colder in a way that made the trail unpredictable. Doyle heard the horses before he saw them. 2 of them laboring up the south trail, blowing hard from the steep climb. He was in the lean-to when they cleared the tree line. He set down his work, walked out into the pale light, and recognized both animals. Town stock. The lead rider was Pratt. Wrong coat for the back country, boots already dark with melt. He looked miserable and furious, which Doyle judged to be his natural condition. The second rider was Locke, broad, flat-featured, the man who kept Pratt's books, and, when Pratt needed it, kept other things. A rifle lay across Locke's saddlebow. Doyle went back into the lean-to, took his shotgun from behind the curing boards, checked both shells, and snapped it shut. He walked out and stood dead center in front of the cabin door. "Long ride," he said. Pratt pulled his horse up 15 feet away. "There's been an accounting error. Going through the Dunmore papers, I found a second note, $22, borrowed against spring supplies. The woman still owes it." It was a lie. Doyle had known men like Pratt his whole life, men who couldn't stand losing what they'd already decided was theirs. The money wasn't the point. The point was Hattie, back in Caro on Pratt's terms. The point was the kind of power small men exercise when they've decided someone belongs to them. The cabin door opened behind him. "Get inside," Doyle said, not turning. "No," said Hattie. She came to stand beside him. She was wearing the canvas coat she'd traded for, off a passing freighter in February, cut down and resewn by her own hand to fit her properly. Her hair was braided back tight. She was holding the skinning knife loosely at her side, blade down. "There is no second note," she said. "There's a signed paper," Pratt said. "Burn it," she said, "because I'll be in Cairo on Thursday to settle every account between me and this company. In writing, in front of witnesses. And if your signed paper can't survive that process, Pratt, it wasn't real to begin with." Pratt's face went ugly. He nodded to Locke. Locke started to raise the rifle. Doyle pulled the right trigger. He aimed 8 feet to Locke's left. The shot blew a chunk of bark the size of a dinner plate off a pine trunk, and both horses went sideways, screaming. Locke dropped the rifle, grabbing for the reins. Pratt's horse spun hard, nearly throwing him. When everything stopped moving, Doyle had the left barrel pointed at the center of Pratt's chest. "You come up this mountain with a gun again," Doyle said, "and I'll give you a proper answer to it." Pratt's horse was still trembling. So was Pratt, though he was working hard not to show it. "Thursday," Hattie said. Her voice cut through the cold air cleanly. "I'll finish it Thursday." She went alone. That had been the argument, and she had won it. Not because Doyle conceded, but because he ran out of things to say that she hadn't already answered. He followed her at a distance. She knew he would. She didn't acknowledge it. The trail to Cairo was soft with melt, and she took her time on the switchbacks. Letting Prospect, borrowed without asking, because Doyle's argument had run out at the same point as his words. Pick his own footing. She arrived just after 10 in the morning, when the company store would be open, and the mill would be running, and there would be witnesses to whatever happened. She tied Prospect at the rail and walked in. Pratt was behind the counter weighing something on the brass scale. He saw her, and his face went careful. He looked behind her for Doyle. There was no Doyle. She walked to the counter and set her canvas bag on the glass. Inside the bag were the doeskin strips she'd been working on since January. Tanned carefully over 6 weeks, using every technique her father had taught her. Cold water stretched, every step done correctly. 20 strips of exceptional backcountry doeskin, soft as butter, no knife marks. Any outfitter between here and Fort St. James would recognize the quality immediately. And underneath those, wrapped in cloth, a small medicine bottle stoppered with pine pitch, half filled with fine placer color from the creek below the cabin. 2 weeks of cold panning in March runoff, barely enough, but enough. She set the bottle on the counter, beside the doeskin. "I want a receipt," she said, "paid in full. Alec Dunmore's account, and any notes bearing his name or mine. Signed, dated, witnessed." She nodded at the mill hand who'd come in behind her for tobacco and was now standing very still near the door. "He'll do." Pratt looked at the doeskin. He looked at the placer bottle. He looked at Hattie. "I don't have to do business with you." No, she'd like him. "But," she agreed, "you will. Because if you don't, I take this to the outfitter in Hazleton, and I tell every trapper and freighter on the route between here and the Nass River that Harlan." Pratt turned away prime doeskin and clean placer, because he was holding a grudge against a widow. She tilted her head slightly. "This country doesn't have room for men who let grudges interfere with trade." Pratt's jaw worked. He weighed the doeskin strip by strip, and she watched his expression change as he worked through them, realizing slowly that they were genuinely exceptional. He tested the doeskin between his fingers. He held a strip to the light. He looked at the placer bottle. He looked at Hattie, with the particular fury of a man who has just understood that he is not, in fact, the cleverest person standing at this counter. He wrote the receipt. He signed it. The mill hand witnessed it without being asked twice. Hattie folded the paper, put it inside her coat, and picked up her bag. "If you ever write my name on a debt paper again," she said quietly, "I'll come back with a solicitor from Prince George, and we'll spend some time going through every account book in this building. I suspect that would be educational for a great many people." She walked out into the pale spring light. Doyle was leaning against a building on the far side of the street. He'd been there the whole time. She could tell by the way he straightened when she came out. Too quickly, the way a person moves when they've been holding themselves carefully still for too long. She walked to him. She held the receipt out. He read it without speaking, then handed it back. "You didn't come in," she said. "No. You could have." "I know." She studied his face. The wind off the mountains had been working on it for a long time. And standing here in the pale spring light of Caro's Main Street, he looked like something made for difficult country and difficult weather, and exactly suited to both. "Why didn't you?" she asked. He was quiet long enough that she thought he might not answer. "Because I wanted to see you walk out of there on your own," he said, "and I didn't want to be standing in the way of it." Hattie looked at the receipt in her hand. She looked at the mountains beyond the tree line, the high ridges where his trap lines ran, where Prospect knew every trail by heart. She looked at the sky, the pale particular blue of a northern March afternoon, the kind of blue that only existed up here, where the air was thin enough to be honest. "The ledger's paid," she said. "I know. So I could go anywhere." "You could." She put the receipt back inside her coat, next to her heart, where the warmth of her own body would keep the ink from running in the cold. "I'm going back up the mountain," she said. He looked at her. Something moved behind his eyes, open and unguarded, the way his face never was, when he thought she was paying attention. "All right," he said. She held out her hand. He looked at it for a moment. Then he took it, his large, rough hand closing around hers with a steadiness that was entirely characteristic of him, the way he did everything, without ceremony, without performance, as if this were simply the correct thing and there was no particular reason to make more of it than that. They walked to the horses together. That night she took the birch bark ledger down from the wall beside the door. She held it in both hands, looking at the charcoal marks, $65 of hash lines, of cold mornings and aching hands, and the slow, grinding work of building something new from the ruins of something lost. She thought about Alec, who'd meant well and hadn't been enough. She thought about Pratt's store and the receipt folded against her chest. She thought about how long it had taken her to understand that survival wasn't the same as living, and that living required you to decide every single day what you were worth. She crossed to the hearth and held the birch bark over the flames. It caught immediately, bright and clean, curling at the edges, the charcoal marks disappearing in a white flash before the whole piece went up. The smoke smelled of pine, the way everything in this country smelled of pine, the way Doyle smelled of pine and cold air and canvas wax when she stood close to him. The ledger was ash. Doyle was in the doorway behind her. She'd heard him come in the way she always heard him. Now, the particular weight of his step, the specific sound of a person who moved through the world without apology for the space they occupied. She turned around. He crossed the room in 3 steps. He put his hands on either side of her face, carefully. The way he handled anything he didn't want to break. And he looked at her with a directness that had nothing in it of performance or plea. Just a man who had made a decision and wasn't hiding it. She reached up and put her hands over his. The fire snapped. Outside, somewhere up on the ridge, a great grey owl called once into the still mountain air, and then went silent. The mountains stood where they had always stood, indifferent, magnificent, patient. Inside the cabin, something entirely different was happening, something finite enough to hold and large enough to last.